Chapter 18. Life After War. With my time at university drawing to a close, I had achieved a first-class honours degree, which had surprised everyone, including myself. Whilst at university, I had encouraged and mentored, not groomed, the younger students, and was presented with the School Ambassador's Award for my efforts. I had set up student-led study groups, revision sessions, and encouraged debate. We'd all benefited from the shared knowledge of the group, and our differing opinions, and this was made evident by all of my high grades. When I started university, my studies had enabled me to suppress my PTSD. Then, through effective therapy, I was able to manage my trauma. But now the real world awaited. It was time to seek out employment. But what? I graduated in the July, had my medical tribunal in the August, and then had surgery to fit a temporary spinal cord stimulator in the September. Employment would have to wait, for now at least. Whilst recovering, I found myself frequently scrolling through social media, and it was apparent that the veterans community was not being heard. In fact, they were being silenced. There'd been a media blackout surrounding the military rallies in support of our Northern Ireland veterans, historic allegations, and their continuous trials. A historic inquiries team had been set up in 2006, and by 2013, all cases from 1968 to the Good Friday Agreement were to be reviewed. Only British soldiers were being hunted, and the paramilitaries, not even the IRA, were avoiding being prosecuted. These rallies would gather momentum under the banner of betrayal and conclude with a series of national rallies the following May, with the main focus being in support of Soldier F and his part in the incident commonly known as Bloody Sunday. I was fortunate not to have been involved in any serious incidents during my 2 tours of Northern Ireland, as these were different times. Yet part of me was now fearful that I may get a knock on the door and that the Iraq Historic Allegations team would come after me for my hand in that airstrike. Then again, I was now conscious that I had PTSD, and unfortunately, this guilt, this paranoia, this harmful mindset was now part of my life. When reflecting on my therapy and how I had benefited from it, I was more aware of other veterans' welfare and began to acknowledge how many of my brothers were taking their own lives. That year alone, 2018, there were 87 military suicides, with 62 of these being veterans. Yet again, there was another media blackout regarding this tragedy. This sudden realization of the lack of governmental support for our veterans infuriated me. Many, like myself, had given their all for their country, and now their cries for help were being purposefully silenced and ignored. I'd always tried to be a realist, and I was aware that I alone couldn't make a significant impact or influence national policy. What I could do, though, was make a small difference, save just one veteran. But how? I was already active locally within the veterans community, as I was the vice chairman of my local branch of the Royal British Legion. I had organised fundraisers and had the support of the local councillors and MPs. Where I live, we were fortunate that our veterans community had the backing and support of our local politicians, but they didn't really understand us. Maybe if our voices were not being heard from the outside, then it was time that someone voiced them from the inside. It was time to get involved in local politics. I had never fully committed to the ideology of either of the main national parties. The Labour Party had sent me to war, then thrown us to the mercy of the mob, and now the Conservative Party was pursuing our Northern Ireland veterans. Locally, it was all about the impact on your local community, and the major political parties were whipped, controlled, and micromanaged. So I decided to run as an independent candidate in the next local election. I was fortunate that I am from a large armed forces community, and that a sitting councillor was a Royal Navy veteran. Stuart and another sitting councillor, Jamie, provided me with all the necessary advice to run a winning campaign, and I was successfully elected and sworn in on the 2nd of May 2019. Within hours of being elected, I was writing letters supporting my local veterans community and making a difference. In my first act, attending a Health and Social Care Scrutiny Committee meeting, I raised my concerns regarding the aftercare of our veterans, particularly their mental health, PTSD, and suicide numbers. I was now able to genuinely voice the concerns of the veterans community rather than use them as a political football, which had previously occurred all too frequently. I had two goals: to diligently represent my electorate to improve my town, and to use my platform as a positive voice to improve the welfare of my own veterans community. The following week, I had made it into the Manchester Evening News, and as a result I was contacted by a local veteran who was at his end and was contemplating suicide. John had been a military clerk and was subject to a near-death experience in Al-Amara, Iraq, in 2004 on Optelic 4. A mortar bomb landed in his place of work and had exploded close by him, and this initiated a string of events fueled by alcohol misuse that saw him leave the army some years later. After this event, his life went drastically downhill as he became dependent on drugs, alcohol, gambling, and any other vice he could find as he shut himself off from the world. John felt worthless and was at the end of his tether. I never thought so, but John was adamant that I saved him when he was at his lowest. And this was achieved by simply meeting once a week and listening to his concerns. I did encourage John to return to therapy and aided him with some applications for benefits, but I merely showed him the path. John should be proud of himself, as he alone dug himself out of his own rut, whereas all I did was offer him moral support and guidance along the way. There are so many other veterans whom I have helped in my initial 2 years as a local politician, but John was the first and deserves a mention. Besides, he has aspirations of paying my help forward and helping other veterans himself, which is easily achievable. I would later use my influence to improve all of my local GP surgeries to be more veteran-friendly through my friendship with another veteran, Simon Carr. After a full and distinguished career in the Royal Artillery, Simon was now employed as a practice manager at a local GP surgery. Yet again, I did very little, and it was Simon who did all of the legwork in ensuring that over 35 other medical practices followed his lead, and therefore all credit must go to him. Furthermore, I was able to influence the local NHS trust to acknowledge that all musculoskeletal injuries post-discharge may have been caused through service. As a result, veterans in my borough would be fast-tracked to see a consultant, but regrettably, such treatment is a postcode lottery, and is, more often than not, personality-led. When I began this project, I was consumed by anger in the aftermath of yet another veteran suicide. This time a fellow Irish Guardsman. A good friend of mine asked me what I was planning to write about and who the target audience would be, and I honestly couldn't answer, as this started out as just a written-down rant My aim has always been to make a small difference and to hopefully raise some general awareness of what my generation experienced. Ultimately, my goal is to encourage open and honest conversations about mental health and to help reduce the damaging stigma that is often associated with it. This is not just in soldiers, but in the wider society in general. And hopefully, by listening to this audiobook, I may inspire and prevent just one suicide. Far too many of my brethren have taken their own lives through the stigma associated with mental health, and many of these could have been prevented through open conversations such as these. It has also been a painful journey of discovery for myself, and it has made me aware that I was not fully open and honest with my therapist when I had my breakdown in 2017. As such, I have reluctantly booked myself back in for further treatment, since, throughout the process of writing this book, I found myself zoning out and reverting back to my pre-programmed military default, which is generally aggressive. As alarming as it sounds, I'm not the only veteran who feels this way. And once integrated back into society, this purposefully trained behavior can often lead to internal struggles which may explain why so many veterans seem to be so angry. What is disturbing, though, is the 9-month waiting list for some one-to-one therapy. I'm not bitter about my service, and I'm far too insignificant to implement institutional change. But I may be able to start conversations on the subject. There will always be a romantic association between susceptible young people and warfare, as nations will always require soldiers. This is despite the recent reduction in troop numbers and their current reliance on technology and autonomous vehicles. The simple fact of the matter is that there will always be a necessity for boots on the ground and close-quarter fighting. What is fascinating, though, is how the current generation of British Army soldiers are recruited and trained, and only time will tell if this is a good thing. My only concern is that you cannot have an army that is combat effective and at the same time one that reflects society's values and standards. This is simply due to the fact that my generation experienced the true nature of warfare over an intensive 20-year period, and consequently are left with the unwanted psychological and emotional scars as a result. When it comes to recruit screening, I fundamentally believe that a psychological assessment should be conducted before all trainees are allowed near any type of firearms. Maybe this should be conducted at their recruit selection, or at least on their initial military medical when they begin their training, as this would go a long way in preventing recruit suicide. In any other organisation or institution, this would not be tolerated, and change would have been implemented long ago. Just imagine if there was a similar trend in recruit suicides in the police or fire service, and how quickly policies would change to amend this. Maybe this is because the death of soldiers is institutionally accepted by the Ministry of Defence, the government, and by wider society in general. In 2014, the cost of training an adult entry soldier was almost £50,000, with just less than a third of trainees dropping out. Surely these figures reinforce the argument of pre-psychological assessment, simply as a cost-cutting measure to the Treasury. Then again, if my generation had been psychologically screened in such a way, I am certain that many, including myself, would not have been deemed suitable for service. In recent years, it was welcome news to see that the British Army had changed its marketing strategy to recruit the current generation of soldiers. It is encouraging to see the emphasis being on feelings, but I don't necessarily agree with the mentality of, it's okay to fail. For my generation, failure on operations often led to death or serious injury. Training methods have become less intense, both physically and mentally, with the real emphasis being targeted towards sports recovery and rest. In my day, these were dirty words, and every physical fitness session was high intensity, and this has had a lasting impact on our bodies. If you ever observe a 40 to 60-year-old in the gym, absolutely thrashing himself to within an inch of his life on a regular basis, then I will almost guarantee that he is a veteran. James Piotrowski was finally diagnosed with PTSD in 2019, and, in a recent interview, described the way that we were being trained as similar to the way one would train a police attack dog. These dogs are kind and approachable and friendly, but once the handler puts on the lead, it instantly becomes highly aggressive. Ski is undoubtedly correct with his comparison, as, through the use of controlled aggression and particularly the very nature of bayonet fighting, my generation of infantry soldiers were the British Army's attack dogs. The only difference is that you don't let a highly trained police dog back into society when they retire. If they are not adopted by their handler, then they are put to sleep. This highlights a pertinent point about my generation and the lack of behavioral training that was provided to incorporate us back into society. When you delve into how many veterans become violent after discharge, are arrested, gain criminal records, or like Ski, become frequently imprisoned, it raises many questions. I am a responsible dog owner, and I am absolutely certain that there is no such thing as a bad dog, only bad owners. Now, when considering that some of my brethren were loving, caring people before they were soldiers, and after discharge they became aggressive and violent, then there has to be some form of accountability. Then there is the taboo question. Why are they like this? Many boy soldiers from underprivileged and deprived backgrounds, such as myself, had been moulded into soldiers. The very identity and concept of the soldier defined us to our very cores. A lot of effort, cost, time, and training indoctrinated us to ignore our basic predispositions of survival and to disregard our fight-or-flight subconscious survival instincts. We were conditioned to advance towards that danger instead, and to ignore our instincts, our emotions, and pain. Then, through behavioral learning such as the Skinnerian method, we were rewarded for success and punished for failure. We were unknowingly reprogrammed to react, feel, and ultimately become complacent and accustomed to killing. One must not forget the harmful, lasting mental consequences of this behavioral learning that was instilled into my generation of soldiers, and this was partly due to the success of the Falklands War. By default, people are not killers, and this was identified by Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall in 1946. After conducting a series of post-combat interviews with U.S. service personnel, Marshall concluded that only 15 to 20% of the individual riflemen in the European theatre of World War II actually fired their weapons with the intent to kill. As a result of this lack of combat efficiency, new training methods were introduced. Significantly, the traditional bullseye for marksmanship training would be replaced with a cutout that resembled another soldier, in an attempt to change the behavioral psychology of the soldier. This, for the British Army at least, would be replaced by a human lifelike figure 11 target. Then, through repetitive behavioral learning by performing a complex set of voluntary motion actions, shooting to kill became second nature, a reflex, instinctive. These new training methods, which were reinforced with conditioning through reflexology, proved to be extremely successful in the frequently bloody 1982 Falklands War that was fought at close quarters. British soldiers were outnumbered 3-1 and, for the most part, were without air and artillery support, and would have to rely on their military conditioning and controlled aggression to defeat the well-equipped and well-dug-in Argentine defenders. Richard Holmes, a retired brigadier, estimates that well over 90% of the British soldiers were shooting to kill, and this was a direct result of modern training techniques. These techniques included reward-based success and punishment for failures, such as point scoring on shooting ranges for quickly shooting targets in the image of other soldiers, reprogramming thousands of years of instinctive human behavior in the process. Then, as a result of this operational success, just a decade later, the British Army would perfect its training methods for my generation, where behavioural learning and combat conditioning were mastered. There is no doubt in my mind that after 20 years' service and 6 operational tours, my own preset and now unfortunate default mentality is to kill. I am fully aware that I was indoctrinated through generational learned battlefield conditioning and behavioural training. But what is the lasting cost to the individual? Who or what is accountable for my generation once we are released back into the civilian world? Surely one would expect some type of reverse behavioural learning on discharge, or at least some mindful awareness training to help us understand why we felt that it is acceptable to kill another human being. This may explain why so many veterans are angry all the time, and often resort to unnecessary violence. Even now, as a civilian, I have no guilt or remorse for any of the enemy soldiers or insurgents that died on the battlefield, as my psychological makeup defines them as inhuman. However, no training was ever provided on accepting the true consequences of warfare, and that is the darker side, the civilians. And this is where my own internal conflict lies. Even after the introduction of trauma risk management, TRIM, it was never fully implemented or used to the best effect throughout operational deployments. The high tempo of combat operations and the ongoing manning issues never allowed time for the welfare of our soldiers. Perhaps if we were deployed for 12-month cycles like our American cousins, then more emphasis would have been directed at welfare in general, particularly the mental well-being of our troops. Personally, I believe that this was partially due to the mentality of the senior commanders' attitudes towards mental health in the 2000s. These soldiers' predecessors had fought and had gained the respect of their peers in the Falklands, and my generation had borne the brunt of the fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Unfortunately for them, they narrowly missed the opportunity to prove themselves in battle as junior commanders, and, as such, they only had experience from their own deployments as junior commanders from Northern Ireland. Don't get me wrong. Northern Ireland was intense and extremely volatile, and statistically more lethal than combat operations in the Middle East in terms of fatalities. But the operational pressures were completely different. These pressures would take their toll on all our psychological makeup, and as time goes on and I distance myself from the military alter ego, I'm slowly regaining my humanity and becoming more in touch with my emotions. This has had a harmful effect on my own mental health, as small incidents from my battlefield experience now seem to really upset me. Specifically, secondary trauma. When I reflect back on all of my friends, buddies, and brethren who were killed, injured, lost limbs, and who, like myself, suffer with their own inner demons, I am consumed by guilt and regret. This is not to be confused with survivor's guilt. but rather an overwhelming and unwanted bitterness that is directed at the institution that is the British Army. I regret this, as I was once a proud and loyal soldier, and I don't want to feel this way. Yet I also feel guilty in the way that I played my own part in conditioning and altering the behavioural psychology of the recruits and soldiers under my command. I had chosen the hero's path as a young naive boy, but then, after years of behavioural reprogramming, I inevitably became an unknowing villain by indoctrinating the next generation of soldiers. Then, once I was injured and no longer combat effective, my eyes were opened to the world of welfare and the charade that it actually was. Don't get me wrong. Pre-9/11, the welfare system was fantastic. But as soon as the British Army committed to 2 prolonged counter-insurgency campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, the welfare of its soldiers became an afterthought. This was evident from the lack of diligence regarding the correct protocols surrounding post-operational stress management, POSM. My generation experienced the non-existent POSM in the 90s, particularly in the aftermath of Kosovo, where my own mental health began to deteriorate, to the well-run 24 to 36 hours of decompression in Cyprus. However, I'm still not convinced that the process of relax, reflect, rest, and regenerate is actually effective, though, or if this was just another umbrella for the Ministry of Defence. Personally, I would have preferred to be compulsorily sat down with a therapist to discuss my experiences, and this would have helped my own, and I'm sure others' soldiers' long-term mental health. The first obvious downside to this is the financial element, and second, the cost to manpower as soldiers such as myself, who, without a doubt, would have been categorically deemed unfit for service due to their battlefield trauma. Then there was the sheer neglect of POSM within individual units to consider. My personal experience was that POSM was just a paper exercise that had to be ticked off as yet another umbrella for the Ministry of Defence. The truth is that the operational demands were always prioritised above the welfare of the individual soldiers, and this was evident within the individual companies, where they blatantly disregarded the welfare of their soldiers. As a result of the high-stress working environment, operational deployment, behavioural training, and controlled aggression conditioning, I was only given a psychological assessment once in almost 20 years, where I was found to, in their words, to lack empathy. This really should have raised several red flags as, along with my indoctrination, I was showing signs of sociopathic and psychopathic traits. Yet I was an experienced, obedient, compliant, and well-respected infanteer, the perfect killing machine. And this is why I believe that psychological testing was not and will never be conducted on British Army soldiers. Besides, the Ministry of Defence had spent hundreds of thousands of pounds in training and conditioning me by this point. So why would you conduct a test on a soldier's psyche when you have retrained their behaviour to go against thousands of years of human instinct to begin with? This is why I categorically believe that individual soldiers will never be screened before they join, after operational deployment, or at specific stages throughout a full 24-year career. Meanwhile, there is the pertinent question of why a mandatory psychological assessment on discharge is not enforced. This would go a long way in helping our veterans understand how and why they feel the way they do. But yet again, what would be the cost? Not just the financial burden, but the cost of damage to the reputation of the British Army. we rely on volunteers to protect us. Young boys and girls from all our communities. These are our brothers, sisters, wives, husbands, daughters, and sons, who join full of optimism, but return broken and psychologically damaged. This is mainly due to the years of behavioural learning that unfortunately is very difficult to shake off. Imagine the lasting damage to the British Army's image, as well as their recruitment and retainment policy, if society were made openly aware of the long-term psychological harm to their sons and daughters as a direct result of their service. Yet again I ask the question, where is the mental health support and accountability from the government? Next, there are those soldiers who are dishonourably discharged to consider. The term bringing the army or regiment into disrepute was frequently thrown around when charging soldiers or even dishonourably discharging them. I recall walking through 10 platoon lines with Bob in 2004, just after we had returned from South Armagh, when we both smelt something fishy. 4 young soldiers who had completed 2 operational deployments in a year were sitting in their rooms smoking cannabis. Consequently, all 4 were dishonourably discharged and thrown out of the army within the week. No questions were ever asked as to why these young boys had turned to drugs in the first place. Nor was any consideration given towards their mental well-being. Perhaps, like Jono, the cannabis gave these soldiers some form of respite from themselves. These lads were heroes from the 2003 war in Iraq, but the army had a zero-tolerance policy regarding drugs, and the clean corporate image of the army was always prioritised. The army, including myself and Bob, never stopped to ask why they were smoking cannabis or thought to investigate any underlying trauma. Instead, we enforced the rhetoric and fulfilled the British Army's needs like mindless drones. Then there were the frequent troublemakers who, through drink or violence, were always being charged. One by one, these would inevitably be dishonourably discharged, with no questions ever being asked as to why they were reacting in such a way. In retrospect, many of these soldiers were acting out as a coping mechanism for their battlefield experiences, as well as the internal struggles that occur after being subject to repetitive behavioural conditioning. Yet again, as an institution, we failed to address the root of the problems, and instead found a quick and easy solution: dishonourable discharge. When you are institutionalised, it is easier to follow the narrative, and that is exactly what we did. I used to joke with Frank that I was too mentally strong to be indoctrinated, despite, quite ironically, already being completely conditioned. Well played, Frank. Well played indeed. Joking aside, my own discharge hit me immensely hard due to the fact that I was entirely indoctrinated. On my discharge, I was lost and didn't know who I was anymore. Niall describes his discharge as being stripped to his core, and he has since joined the reserves, like so many others, to fill that void in his life. Identity and self-preservation are important components of the soldier's psyche, and it wasn't until the Manchester Arena bombing that I stopped thinking like one. Yet again, this is where, as part of an individual soldier's resettlement program, a psychological assessment or mental awareness training would be a valued tool to the long-term mental well-being on their return to civilian life. Then again, once you leave the forces, you are an afterthought, and the aftercare is minimal. The aftercare that injured veterans receive on discharge is a postcode lottery and, as such, is a disgrace. Amputees struggle with the management of their stumps and the access to decent prosthetics. Those suffering with PTSD often find themselves waiting for almost 12 months for psychological therapy, and some doctors are simply not aware of how to deal with veterans. The government has allowed my generation to become dependent on military charities for their mental and physical well-being, which is despicable. Help for Heroes, the Royal British Legion, Combat Stress, and SAFA never sent us to war. The British government did. So why are they not accountable for our aftercare? With the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan becoming a distant memory, the funding streams of these charities are quickly drying up, leaving far too many of my brethren in dire need. This is further exacerbating the damaged relationship that the veterans community already has with society, and is reminiscent of what American society endured in the post-Vietnam era. Once discharged, the aftercare that our veterans receive is well below par. Even scarier than one would expect for the boys and girls who had sacrificed their health protecting our country. A good example of this is Paddy's story. Paddy stood on what he believes to be a Soviet-era butterfly anti-personnel mine in Afghanistan in November 1929, and was casually evacuated by Frank. His right leg below the knee was blown off immediately, which is why he is convinced that this was a mine strike and not a conventional IED. He was subsequently medically discharged in 2014, after receiving compensation for his inarguable claim with the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme for his missing limb. However, some 4 years after discharge, Paddy needed to have his left leg amputated below the knee due to vascular issues that were caused by the additional pressure on that particular leg. This amputation was not a result of the mine blast he suffered in Afghanistan, but it is a direct consequence of his initial injury. Initially, Paddy had received treatment that was second to none from the Veterans Prosthetic Panel, and had 4 prosthetic limbs custom-made for different activities, such as running, whereas the NHS would only provide him with 1 prosthetic for that particular leg. Paddy is receiving bipolar treatment, and his recovery is shared between the NHS and the Ministry of Defence. Both departments are passing the buck in terms of accountability for these amputations, as one happened in service and the other did not. Regardless, Paddy is now a double-leg amputee as a result of his sacrifice in Afghanistan, and is receiving inadequate treatment. Also, there is the uphill battle that Paddy is about to face when claiming compensation for his recent amputation, as I anticipate that the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme will generally deny accountability. I have no doubt in my mind that there is a direct link to veteran suicide and how the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme operates. Personally, I have witnessed this unproductive process destroy people's lives. The scheme is purposefully designed to stall, delay, and deter claimants at every opportunity, and is purposefully disadvantageous towards injured soldiers and veterans. It has exacerbated PTSD in so many veterans, including myself, and has avoidably had a hand in far too many suicides. By failing to accept the depth of my friend Chris's PTSD, this led to fatal and preventable consequences. Furthermore, the process, in my opinion, is biased as it favours the Ministry of Defence, and this is currently destroying Nathan's life, and undoubtedly many others. The ripple effects of this inadequate scheme reach far and wide, as it is never just the individual soldier who suffers. It is also their family and friends, and these are the ones who are left to pick up the pieces. Then there is the ongoing pandemic of veteran suicides in general to discuss, or not, in the case of the British government. They refuse to acknowledge this, and the only people documenting the cases is the Veterans United Against Suicide group. The US government has researched this and has linked military service to an increased risk of suicide in veterans. But the British government purposefully remains coy on the subject and refuses to investigate this current stain on our armed forces community. In 2020, suicides in the British Army were at a 15-year high, and this is something that the Ministry of Defence actively monitors. What is not being recorded is the 161 veteran suicides from 2018 to 2020, and we need to start having conversations regarding this painful and difficult subject. It is the inadequate aftercare of our veterans that has left me with a bittersweet opinion from my 2 decades of service to my country. Many of these unfortunate veterans paid the ultimate price from a government and society that has, without doubt, abandoned, betrayed, and rejected them. A study from 2016 concluded that the rate of suicide among Army males aged 16 to 19 has been much higher than among civilians of the same age, and this cannot be as a result of combat operations due to their age. Thus, it must be correlated to how they were trained, conditioned. Furthermore, on leaving the military, those aged between 16 and 24 years old are between 2 and 3 times more likely to kill themselves. There are many contributing factors at play here, but the way in which British soldiers are trained must not be ignored. This issue will not go away any time soon, and the government needs to get its head out of the sand and become accountable. I do not blame Tony Blair for his naivety for blindly going to war with Iraq in 2003. However, to this day, I am still appalled at the successive governments' relentless pursuit of our veterans. The combination of the ongoing pursuit of Northern Ireland veterans and the investigations into our Iraq veterans is beyond despicable. Where is the persecution and accountability for the political elite? We, as soldiers, put our faith, our trust, our lives, blindingly and foolishly, into a fractured society that was polarized by absolute political politics, that toyed with our lives for small political gains. Yet despite recent laws coming into place, such as the Overseas Operations, Service Personnel and Veterans Bill, that should protect our veterans against historic allegations, I remain dubious. However, like many other veterans, I have lost faith in our relationship with society, particularly the government, and we are mindful that laws and the social acceptance of veterans today can quickly change to support a future, more popular rhetoric. After all, the political elite have, quite frankly, a history of throwing individuals to the wolves at the drop of a hat to avoid any political backlash. This began with Tony Blair's political masterclass, when reacting to the public outcry against the lack of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, by simply having the army take responsibility for his actions. This political sleight of hand immediately damaged our society, resulting in a severed relationship between the public and its armed forces that will take another generation to fully repair. And this will only begin with accountability for the improved welfare of our nation's veterans. I have so many regrets regarding my time in the British Army. but I do have vast pride in the positive impact that I made within my early career, the pinnacle being in Kosovo. The men with whom I grew into adulthood, particularly in 10th Platoon, became my family. This is much more than a brotherhood, as this was cemented through our shared experiences of warfare. Some of these men considered me like a father figure or big brother. Ironically, and quite comically, Pez still refers to me as a father figure, despite the fact that I am 6 months younger than him. I have a genuine love for these men, and felt tremendous pride over the years watching many of these men successfully progress through the ranks. Of the men of 10th Platoon who served together in Kosovo, 4 of them achieved late entry commissions, whereas others achieved warrant rank, which is quite notable. Then there are the other men of 10th Platoon who served in Iraq. It was heartbreaking to witness some of these men being injured in Afghanistan and, even more so, the ones who have suffered with their own mental health over the years. This is a direct consequence of witnessing the true horrors that warfare has to offer. The darker side of combat that no amount of behavioural training can prepare you for. These are both excellent platoons, of equal measure, and I could easily write a book about each of their exploits and battlefield experiences. Unfortunately, as a result of military restructuring, infantry battalion numbers have been reduced, and 10th Platoon, along with No. 4 Company, are no more. This saddens me, as I continue to be immensely proud that I had the privilege of climbing through all of the ranks of 10th Platoon, from the most junior Guardsman to the most senior rank of Platoon Sergeant. I'm very much a 10th Platoon soldier, before I am an Irish Guardsman, and I will always have unwavering loyalty and admiration for these men that I have the pleasure to serve with. My military career began with a bombing by the IRA in 1996 in Manchester city centre, and ended with the ISIS arena bombing in Manchester in 2017. Although I was discharged 18 months prior to the Ariana Grande concert bombing, I still perceived myself as a soldier. And it was this traumatic event that released me from this detrimental mindset. From the outside looking in, I can clearly see the irreparable damage that has been done and is still being done by the Ministry of Defence towards our armed forces community. If I had one wish, and I could change just one thing, it would undoubtedly be to improve the mental health treatment of all service leavers. Specifically, a psychological decompression assessment on all types of discharge. I fundamentally believe that this would save lives, as well as improving the mental well-being of future veterans. As I previously mentioned, I was initially angry when I started this project in early 2021. But after interviewing so many veterans, my anger quickly turned to sadness. In my day, the British Army was proud to refer to itself as being the best. But when it came to the welfare of its soldiers and the aftercare post-discharge, unfortunately, this was far from the case. Sadly, my generation, my brethren, are testament to this. And we are burdened with the psychological scars of warfare every single day. And that is the hidden consequence of life after war.